So here we are again in Microsoft building in the digital living room, and I have Ben Adams with me. We're at the Core Start 2.0 conference, and Ben has just finished his session. So Ben, can you tell us something about yourself, what you do normally do, and what was your talking about in the session?
I'm a CTO and co-founder of Illyriad Games. We specialize in massively multiplayer online games using WebGL and .NET in the server. Currently working on Age of Ascent, which is an ultra MMO, aiming to have thousands of concurrent players in the same battle and millions of concurrent players in the same game. I'm also a Microsoft MVP, and I just gave the talk on performance in .NET Core 2.0 and all the fantastic improvements that have been made and what sort of changes they are. Some of them you get without making any code changes yourself. You just move to the new platform and you automatically get them. And then some are extra boosts you can get from adopting some new practices.
Mm-hmm. So the game, the Age of Ascent, how many concurrent users do you have? Is it in production already?
It's still in development. Mm-hmm. We did a Guinness World Record attempt a couple of years ago, and we didn't quite make it. We had 997 concurrent players in the same battle in real-time combat, and the record was 1,002 at the time. So we were about almost 6 off.
Almost there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And is there anything interesting in the server side? I bet there is a lot of crazy stuff which normal application developers cannot meet. I believe we will use some microservices architecture and stuff like that.
The networking and the communication we do is incredibly fast-paced. So we sort of approach that as almost like a high-frequency trading platform.
Yeah.
And then how we deal with, obviously we don't want to deploy to hundreds of thousands of servers because that's a high cost. So we only want to we only want to use the resources we need at any particular point. But as more players come in, or if they group in a certain area, we need to scale up, and then as they sort of dissipate, we can scale back down. And so we use Azure Service Fabric to help manage that and orchestrate our microservices. It's all based on microservices and using ASP.NET Core.
Mm-hmm. And what are your opinions on Service Fabric? It's quite new service in Azure. Is it ready for production, or there are some flaws and problems you are experiencing maybe?
I think, it's completely ready for production. There are different ways of thinking that may, from a traditional big server, single box approach that you have to sort of adopt. It's one amazing feature I think about it is so in a lot of people, even if they are using microservices and they can get the scaling of that middle tier or front end and back end, they would still perhaps use a single storage, single database, and that's not scaling with their demand.
That's basically that you a monolith in the application.
You're still tied to how big can your database or your data scale. Or you might shard it into different groups, but that doesn't dynamically increase the way your microservices can. And one of the interesting things Service Fabric does is your data is with your microservices. So as you scale up, the number of instances, the number of nodes you're running on, your data throughput and capacity also scale at that same rate. But conversely, something you have to watch, perhaps with Service Fabric, is the data is also in memory. So you don't necessarily want to store all your data in it, because that's an expense. If you have data that's not been accessed in 3 months or a year, it's an expensive way to store it in RAM. And so you might want to archive that off to a different data store, and then if you get something in that's looking at that data, then you reload it. Also, you might want to. It doesn't have traditional SQL or that sort of thing. So you might want to periodically export it to give to data analysts or marketing databases, so you can do analytics and so forth on that, on sort of periodic snapshots of that data.
It must be very different to a classic business application when you need to track the history of all the records and all of the data in games. The current state is much more important, I believe, than the history. You need to do some snapshots, as you said. It must be a very interesting experience, because most of the developers, I believe, don't write games, so this is a completely different approach to designing the application. Are you using some persistent storages? What is if you are exporting the data, are you using SQL or some document databases, or?
We use so for sort of large archival data, we'll put that in blob storage, because that's quite cost effective. For ad hoc queries, reporting, analysis, then we export that to SQL Server, and we do take. So we come from enterprise backgrounds, I think we don't necessarily do things the way game developers even do. So we're sort of a hybrid between the two approaches. So we do the exports to SQL Server, and then we have all the flexibility and power that gives us.
And you can use the existing reporting tools and things like that.
Exactly.
You don't have to develop your own or use some unusual ones on document databases. So you were saying you have some enterprise background. What were you doing before you started with games?
I used to work at Experian, which is a customer data organization. They work in big data about credit and marketing and they sort of act as a third-party trusted intermediary from businesses to businesses and share their data. So that was my previous background before I got into games.
And do you get tired of that? So you said, "Oh, okay, I will build myself a game."
Well, my business partner was like, come be your own boss. It'll be, you can do what you want and decide your own destiny. And then, when it does turn out that actually a game isn't necessarily as simple, because instead of business customers, you then have thousands and tens of thousands of consumers who each have competing demands. They're like, oh, I want this feature, I want that feature, and suddenly you have thousands of bosses instead of
instead of being your own boss, because everybody is telling you what you should do and
what the next features will be.
And how did you started with open source?
My first foray into open source was with some JavaScript WebGL libraries, because it was quite new, and we wanted to use WebGL. So we also had to help advance the libraries that worked with WebGL at the time, because it was very new. And then when .NET Core and ASP.NET Core came out, we wanted to use that instead of like HTTP listener traditional approach. And so we started writing our own web server that would work with ASP.NET Core. And I was talking to the team in Microsoft about it, you know, what APIs and interfaces I had to implement in order to do it. And David Fowler from the .NET team, after explaining how to do it all, said, well, but you know, why are you doing it? You could always contribute to our server. And I said, yeah, that's a good idea, because then, you know, you've written all the tests already, and you know, you'll code review my code, so there's a lot of burden that I don't have to do, because they've got all the infrastructure for testing, and they do code review and things. So I started contributing to the Kestrel web server, and from there to .NET Core as well, and you know, the rest is history, I suppose.
Yeah. And what are your most favorite repos?
I particularly like Kestrel, the web server. You know, it's good to. It's quite interesting, you know, trying to make it go faster, do things, you know, push improvements. But then Core CLR and Core FX, I also quite like. The Core CLR probably more taking sort of discovering things in Kestrel, you know, rough edges in the runtime, and then going down a few levels and trying to improve it there, and talking with the engineers who work on that, and then they can change the jitter, and it's you know, is really quite interesting. The C# language repository is interesting. Because it's a completely different, rather than code, it's more of discussions on how things should evolve, and all the different opinions, and you know, people trying to come up with good solutions is really interesting. But you know, they're like heavyweight discussions of, you know, 10,000 comments on.
Sometimes it's very difficult because of there are so many people who started being involved in the .NET development and in the open source. I think that Microsoft has learned how to work with the communities actually, and that they're being very transparent in many decisions and things.
Yeah, they are. Yeah. I mean, Core CLR is. Each of the repositories has a different flavor and a different approach. Core CLR is quite interesting because generally it's a very simple approach, because you go, if I make this change, it's better, and they're like, that's good. And then if you move to Core FX, which is the layer above it, is different, because that's about exposing APIs to the public, and then it's like, what are the right APIs? What's the best approach to do? And then ASP.NET is similar in that regard, where you know, they're trying to work out what the best design is. Whereas you know, in Core CLR, it's more simple because the APIs are hidden, so you're not changing things for the customer. You're just, it's how the mechanics of it works, and it's just improving it. So there's less discussion on. There's discussion on what the right approach to make it, you know, is throughput better, is performance better, but there's less discussion on, you know, what's the correct API design, because that happens at the higher levels. So they've each got their own, you know, personalities, each of the repositories.
Recently, I saw some screenshot on Twitter. There was a stack trace, and you were showing what should be changed in the default stack traces, because if your code is using some async await calls, the stack trace is practically unreadable. So you have started a new project for demystifying the exceptions. Is it still work in progress, or what's the plans?
So the demystifier for the stack trace, that's the stack traces are sort of almost C# 1.0. They would have made complete sense. But as all the new features have come in through different versions of C#, the stack trace hasn't changed, and it exposes all the compiler tricks that C# is doing. Yeah, and as you say, it async and lambdas and local functions, so it becomes unreadable, and it doesn't help you when something's gone wrong. It doesn't help you as much as it should. So I've started contributing some changes to the stack trace in Core CLR, but that is one area where it's a little bit more controversial, and there's some discussion between different teams, and between the C# team, between the CoreFX and runtime teams, what the best approach is. So, as you say, I've started working on a library that you can then use, and that will improve your stack trace, turn it back to the C# that looks like your function rather than the bizarre stuff you get out. And it's a work in progress, but since I presented it today, I'm looking at open sourcing it and releasing it today as a sort of follow-on from my talk.
Do you think that it will actually get in the framework someday?
I hope so. I hope so. But I think there's some discussion.
Maybe because there is the exception .toString method, which I think they won't like to change the outputs, which because it could be a breaking change. But there could be some to Ben string or something like that. Maybe.
I think that would be worthy. You should propose it as an API. I'll certainly back it.
Okay, so I get at least one like for the suggestion. And do you have any other community events or user groups where you are speaking? I guess in the UK you have to speak a lot. Communities.
Yeah, not currently. Because we're on the game, we're sort of in a crunch time, so we're pushing for the release. So
So do you have some conferences scheduled? Where can the viewers of this video, where can they see you next time? Except of GitHub and Twitter and all the online channels.
As I say, I don't have anything.
You don't have any schedule.
But I'm looking at. So I used to do blogging a while ago, but I've been involved in getting the game ready. However, doing this talk has inspired me to maybe, because I did quite a high level presentation, to maybe do some deep dives in blog posts of explaining some of the stuff I covered in more depth, and then that might lead to some more in-depth sort of presentations that I can do.
And next year in March there is an MVP summit. Are you planning to attend it?
Definitely. I went to the one last year, and it was really informative, great fun, and
you
met
meet
all these wonderful MVPs.
Okay. What do you think about Prague? Are you going to visit it somewhere in the future again?
Yeah, I'd like to come back with my wife and explore Prague. It's a wonderful city.
Okay, thanks. Next year in November we are doing a conference called Update, because it will be about updating your skills of the attendees. We plan to have a lot of speakers from abroad, from UK, US, Europe and other places in the world. So we will definitely invite you to speak at this conference.
I'd love to come back.
Okay, so that was Ben Adams. Ben, it was a pleasure to have you here in this interview and also in the conference. I hope you will enjoy the rest of your stay in Prague and Czech Republic, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.